Shoot.
All is well.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Pareces Polorit. Hello, everybody. I welcome you to the panel discussion organized by the ARPA Institute on an assessment of the war. Our panelists are Dr. Anna Ohanyan, Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, and Dr. Arman Grigoryan. And our moderator is Ambassador Dr. Armen Bayburtian. And the ambassador is now going to introduce the speakers and the panelists, and we are going to start. For those of you who have no idea about the ARPA Institute, please go to our website, arpainstitute.org, and read about our activities. Our activities are mainly in Armenia with the universities and the government and the institutes of the academy. And the only thing we do here in Los Angeles and outside of Armenia is the organization of such events. So please, please visit our website and please donate so we can help Armenia more, and especially now for the war, we are trying to raise funds to help Artsakh. Please help us. Before we start though, I would like to ask everybody for a minute of silence. Please don't make any noise, and silent for 1 minute to respect our heroes who have fallen so far, and all our soldiers fighting for Armenia. Thank you. Dr. Bayburtian, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself, please, unmute yourself.
Yes, yes. Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking Mr. Hako Panosyan for putting together this panel discussion. Mr. Panosyan is the president of ARPA Institute and a foreign member of the Armenian National Academy of Sciences. And I can tell you all his events are absolutely fascinating. So I'm following majority of them, and I can tell you that they are really high quality. Today's panel is very special because we have three distinguished professors, scholars, specializing in international relations, in conflict resolution, democratization, minority rights, etc. And I have a pleasure of knowing them personally. And I can tell you that Mr. Panosyan was able to organize a panel that someone could only dream to have such panelists. The topic of today's panel is assessment of the military offensive by Azerbaijan and Turkey. Very timely one in terms of the panel, as far as we are facing a full-scale, large invasion, the aggression from Azerbaijan and Turkey, as you know, and everyone has how the international system responds. Conflict, what's happening on the ground, what are the positions of the countries who have interests, what changed since the war of 1992 when Nagorno Karabagh population was attacked and eventually the war was over in 1994 with a ceasefire of May 12. It would be very interesting if our panelists, and I'm sure they will be doing that, focus on the role of Turkey in this conflict, which is a game changer. Turkey is playing a very destructive role, undermining peace process, the fragile humanitarian ceasefire that was agreed. So Turkey is encouraging Azerbaijan to break it, participating directly in the war, in the conflict. And also, let me remember in this context, let me recall that in 1993, when there was a failed coup d'etat in Russia, Turkey at that time has a very serious intention to invade Armenia. That was confirmed by several European Union ambassadors and also Greek ambassador Leonidas Chrysanthopoulos. He has written, actually his book, I'm sure it is a very much familiar one, to everyone regarding the foreign policy of Armenia and the Caucasus. He refers to this plan of Turkey to attack Armenia, to invade Armenia, which was stopped, and Russia at that time intervened very strongly, and Turkey was not able to implement this plan. But why I'm referring to this, because since then, so always Turkey was on the threat perception list of Armenia. And we all knew about support that Turkey renders to Azerbaijan, very strong, both political, moral, diplomatic, and military support, economic support. But this time, Turkey directly participates in the aggression. So it would be interesting for our followers today to know the position of panelists about that, about the factors and circumstances that stipulated such an aggressive militaristic policy of Turkey, domestic, external factors, and also about the position of other major regional and global players, Russia, Iran, the United States, European Union, Israel, and also about the role of the global leadership or the lack of global leadership in this period of COVID and pre-election period in the United States, and especially also we would be interested to know the opinion of the panelists regarding Russia, and not only the opinion, but also projections, or policy approaches and projections of the upcoming steps of Russia and other countries who have interest and stake in this conflict. Engagement by Turkey of jihadi terrorists from the Middle East already meant that the scope of the conflict, the scope geography of the conflict was expanded. What that means for the region and implications for other countries matter. That also would be something that we need to touch upon, and also the reaction, possible reaction, not only so far that we witnessed, but also projections towards this factor that Turkey brought to the regional scale. Let me stop here. Let me introduce our panelists briefly. Dr. Anna Ohanyan is the Richard Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College, Massachusetts, and two-time Fulbright Scholar to South Caucasus. Her latest three books are Russia Abroad, Driving Regional Fracture in Post-Communist Eurasia and Beyond, Networked Regionalism as Conflict Management, and Armenia's Velvet Revolution, co-edited with Laurence Broers. And all of them are published by reputable Georgetown University Press, Stanford University Press, and Tauris. She has also published numerous articles in journals and contributed to the Washington Post Foreign Policy magazine, the National Interest, Al Jazeera, and Wilson Quarterly, and others. She served as a doctoral fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She has consulted for numerous organizations such as the United Nations Foundation, the World Bank, the National Intelligence Council Project, the US Department of State, the Carter Center, and USAID. Her fieldwork has taken her to Russia, Northern Ireland, and the South Caucasus, as well as the Balkans. Let me mention that we had I have the pleasure of meeting her in Armenia back. I remember it was probably 2008 or 2009 when she was on Fulbright Scholarship in Armenia, and we had a very interesting and long discussion. So she's a brilliant scholar, and we'll be happy to hear from her at today's panel. Dr. Nerses Kopalan is our next panelist. He's an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, representing West Coast today. His field of specialization includes international relations, geopolitics, political theory, and philosophy of science. He had extensive research on polarities, purpose, and security studies. He's the author of World Political Systems After Polarity, Rutledge, and the co-author of Sex, Power, and Politics, Palgrave Macmillan. He also authored 2 policy papers for the Republic of Armenia, Transitional Justice Agenda for the Republic of Armenia, Ministry of Justice, and Changing the Paradigm in Armenia Diaspora Relations, Office of the High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs. He also serves as advisor to this office of the High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs. His current research concentrates on geopolitical and great power relations with an emphasis on Eurasian. He has also done extensive work on political developments in Armenia prior and subsequent to the Velvet Revolution. And recently we had an opportunity to follow his very interesting presentation on diaspora at ARPA Institute panel. Our next scholar is Dr. Armand Grigorian, who is an associate professor in international relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He specializes in the study of conflict and international relations theory. Professor Grigorian holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University, an MA in international relations from the University of Chicago, and an undergraduate degree with a major in Turkish studies from the Yerevan State University. His publications have appeared in International Security, International Studies Quarterly, International Political Science Review, Nationalities Papers, and Ethnopolitics. He edited and provided the foreword for the English language publication of Levon Petrosyan's articles, the first president of Armenia, speeches and interviews by Palgrave. Armand Grigorian is currently working on a book about third-party interventions in conflicts between states and minorities. Let me also add that he worked for the Armenian government for several years in 1991 and 1993. He's really fantastic scholar, and I always read with great interest his article, his works, and we are privileged to have him as well as all our panelists today. Dr. Ohanyan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Armen. I do miss you. We both in our family do miss you having on this coast. So it's great to see you, but I wish the circumstances have been different. And it's a big thanks for ARPA Institute for organizing this. And it's wonderful to be on a panel, on the same panel with Nerses and Arman, with whom I've been engaging separately, but kind of coming together. I think it's going to be enriching for us, for me in particular. I've always looked up to their scholarship. In regards, I very much appreciate the emphasis, Armen, that you have put in regards as to what matters in particular in this current war that is happening in Artsakh. And here I have in some of my more recent writing, I have highlighted that militarization, the emergence, regionalization of the previously more localized, more contained, more limited conflict structure is the problem. And I also, so today, I will primarily focus on the drivers of this particular confrontation, to put it the offensive, and highlight factors that I think are driving the processes on the ground. And it is important, I think, to make this distinction because the sources, the causes, and the consequences of everything before this is different. What's happening in right now in Artsakh, in this war, I do think is a litmus test as to how weakening international institutions and diplomatic structures are dealing with these types of conflicts. And this is also canary in a coal mine, because I do think that the existing data does show that these types of conflicts will be increasing in the next few years. So, and I do believe that placing what's happening on the ground in a global context is really critical for our leadership, for community leaders, for scholars, as well as for the government to advocate for the right intervention and to do it effectively. I think we, as a community, we seem to be frustrated as to why the world is not responding the way it should. But I would argue that it is critical to frame, to essentially explain as to what's in it for the world, for the international community, for the European Union. And the stakes are enormous, I would, as I will try to show. Very briefly, the violence, the war, the unresolved conflict in Artsakh, more recent period, it's more recent period, obviously started, I'm not going to provide a historical background to this, but basically it did start in the twilight years of the Soviet years. It did start as a political contestation, then communal violence. After the war ended with the ceasefire in 1994, it was also described by scholars and analysts as a low intensity conflict, meaning that the loss of soldiers at the line of contact was always hovering around 25. What we're seeing right now is an unprecedented attrition rate linked to obviously the entry of a new actor, Turkey in this case, but also the use of the advanced technologies as well, which contributes to makes this particularly violent and deadly. I do want to introduce one concept. Actually, it's not my concept. This is a concept used in a peace research scholarship, which is a subfield of international relations and comparative politics, security studies, grew out of the Uppsala University. The concept is state formation, protracted conflict. Secessionist conflict, I tends to have a negative connotation. And state formation, protracted conflict, really communicates the protracted nature of this conflict. It communicates how difficult these types of conflicts are to resolve. They're also hard to win militarily. They're also difficult to negotiate through a settlement. And majority of these types of conflicts are actually neither here nor there, which can have its own negative consequences, economic and political. So in terms of the, just to recap this segment of my time, and I'll try to finish up quickly so we can have more time for Q&A. Again, this conflict is becoming regionalized, meaning it is, while previously it was more contained, it was always viewed as separate from the conflicts in Georgia, as different in terms of the way it is related to Russia in particular. So this is becoming much more, turning into a conflict cluster with the possibility of affecting neighboring Iran because of the Azerbaijani population, but also population is mobile. Azeris and Armenians are mobilized inside Georgia as well. So there is a spillover potential consequence there. But most importantly, most worrisome, and this is obviously what we need to be stressing on when speaking to international audiences, is that a dangerous cluster of connecting with a Middle Eastern conflict is something to watch for. Number two, it is also changing because its geopolitical dimension is much more pronounced than before. Much of this region has always been, throughout much of the 20th century, part of a particular regional order, mostly of, actually, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing Russia has been a dominant, quote unquote, security provider, whether when this conflict was part of Transcaucasia and the Russian Empire, or whether it was part of Soviet Union. So what we're seeing right now is somewhat unique. I hesitate to be very to specifics, just simply because I have not done field work on this. In particular, to me, it's unclear whether Turkey here is challenging. Clearly, it is challenging Russia's dominance in this region. Many are questioning whether Russia is able to defend its turf, to put it bluntly. But also, it does remain unclear to me whether Turkey is a transactional player here, a transactional troublemaker, or a committed and a long-term disruptor. And perhaps we can elaborate on that a little bit more. The use of high-tech warfare and the privatization of violence. Studies do show that with the decline, after the post-Cold War period, there was, quote unquote, a golden era, and in a very limited sense, in terms of ability of the international community to negotiate civil wars, including these types of state formation conflicts. In 1989 to 2010, there was an increase in negotiated resolutions of these types of conflicts. 35 agreements were reached, which is about 31% of conflicts in general. But what has been happening since is the introduction of proxy players, jihadist groups in this conflict, and the share of conflict with this type of component increased from 5% in early 2000s so this number is increased by 40%. So when proxy players do engage, they do extend the durability, the duration, and the lifespan, and the average lifespan of an already protracted conflict. So this is also to keep in mind when communicating broadly. Proxy wars, since we are on the subject, proxy wars do also signal a low-cost support by an ally. So combined with the use of drones, this privatization of violence, the use of bringing the jihadists from one conflict region to another, all of this indicates that the barriers to entry to war, the barriers to violence have gone down. So the cost for players, authoritarian, essentially, to put it mildly, mischievous players, players is much lower. So Turkey can do this, and its troops are not deployed. One could argue that perhaps this signals an easier pullback if the right incentives are and pushback is done on Turkey. So that's also a trend that is happening, definitely worrisome in terms of how the conflict is changing on the ground. In terms of the, let me see, I'm looking at my slides, but I'm not going to subject you to PowerPoint, so I'm not going to share them. Here, since we are talking about Russia and Turkey, people have been talking about, Armen mentioned that Turkish government has had plans of annexation. Territorial expansion, territorial annexation in general has emerged as one of the more strongest norms that has been protected by the international law, which explains the rapid decline of state-to-state warfare. In this particular case, when thinking about Turkish new, very aggressive policies, neo-Ottoman policies, as Erdogan has plainly explained this, that it is such, I think it is critical to figure out whether, as I mentioned already, whether this is going to be transactional or more long-term, whether this is going to be played out institutionally or territorially. And in this respect, so Turkish-Azerbaijan relationship needs to be viewed in this context. As I'm looking, I do think that Azerbaijan, even if it gets any territorial gains, that absolutely will be a short-term win for the Aliyev regime, but I do think that Azerbaijan will emerge as a loser from this alliance with Turkey. Azerbaijan-Turkey relationship is much more similar to me to Belarus-Russia relationship, so perhaps we can talk about that as well. I do want to highlight, and here, it is an argument that usually is lost in the media, that the driver of this particular confrontation is of one, if I could put it, if I could describe it as domestically embedded geopolitical factors that are driving this. What I mean by this, the conflict in the Velvet is a critical factor here. Armenia's Velvet Revolution in 2018. This war is happening. Armen, how much time do I have before? I tend to go on.
Limit all presentations to 20 minutes.
Okay, so let me start summing up.
You have since still 10 minutes, I believe.
Okay, so okay, so in terms of the Velvet dimension, we should keep in mind that geopolitical factors are obviously important, and we have been talking about how the questions as to how effective Russia is in protecting its turf, whether Russia-led a regional order will be holding or not, and whether Turkey is trying to enter this particular region. So all of those are important conversation. But what I do think is equally important is that understanding and recognizing that these foreign policies do have domestic roots, and that this war is happening in a background of growing authoritarian resurgence around the world, number one, growing mass protest around the world. We see what's happening in Belarus, Hong Kong, Kyrgyzstan, and this level of mass protest was already high before the pandemic. So in the specific case as to why this matters is that in the case of the South Caucasus in particular, and this is the Velvet factor that I wanted to draw your attention, is that the Velvet Revolution in Armenia did create a democratic dyad with a neighboring Georgia, meaning that within South Caucasus, the democratic pole strengthened after the Velvet Revolution. And numerous studies, quantitative studies, show that in such cases, the pressure on authoritarian countries in the region increases to defend their model. So normally, save for external intervention, this provides a very fruitful structural change for the remaining authoritarian states to move towards to democratize and to reform. So this is one factor that is critical. But with the parallel development, and I do think that this velvet potential was unrealized, but that I think is a separate conversation in terms of we could assess the quality of diplomacy from the Pashinyan government, etc., or in the West and the Europeans as well, in not seizing on the structural change effectively. But with the parallel trend to this formation of this democratic dyad was this Turkey, Azerbaijan, actually Erdogan-Aliyev authoritarian coordination. Both strong men, they do have very specific and very narrow political goals to gain from this confrontation. And I'm not diminishing the importance of this conflict for Azerbaijani society. However, in this particular time, in this particular form, this alliance is designed to address several authoritarian goals of regime survival for Aliyev, obviously. I think it's the fact that there is strong diversionary war elements in this case is hard to dispute. And for Erdogan, this allows Erdogan to appease to its nationalist base and also split the opposition and pull in the nationalist secular forces. So that's a very important component to consider. This
Anna, I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. So if you would agree, and I would propose to all other speakers the same, as you indicated from the very beginning, if we can limit the presentations to 15 minutes or even less, then we will have more time for
Sure, absolutely. So I'm assuming that I probably went over. I tend to lose track of time. I'm sorry when I do present. Very good. Let me sum up then simply that, and slowly hand over that I do think that in terms of the velvet, and I'm hoping that the other two speakers also will point to this, the argument that Russia is penalizing Armenia because of the velvet, I don't share that. There's no support for it. We can talk about this. Russia, Pashinyan, on the contrary, actually, Putin is to gain, has advantages from Armenia being democratic. Democratic societies are more open, more messy, more easy to manipulate. But also, there was a coexistence. Putin does get legitimacy points from having this democratic country in its largely authoritarian institutions. So perhaps we can talk about that. I'll stop here, and we can maybe have a conversation as to what could have been done in terms of deepening the velvet impact in the region towards security. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and it was very interesting to follow your points regarding state formation, protracted conflict concept, and all the factors, including cluster that this conflict turned into a cluster itself, but being linked to the Middle Eastern cluster, and Turkey's challenge to Russia's dominance, the role of proxy players, and etc. And especially also interesting was the role of Velvet Revolution, your perception of that, and also authoritarianism, the growing authoritarianism. So I don't want to go into details while summing up your presentation. It would be better to move to another presentation by Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. And if everyone agrees, so I'm proposing to limit the presentations to 10-15 minutes and to have more time for Q&A. Dr. Kopalyan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the ARPA Institute for hosting this, and thank you to the Ambassador for being a the discussant and moderator. My assessment of these developments is going to be a little different than Anna's. I'm going to begin sort of attempting to present the logic of Azerbaijan's invasion, what led to it, the various possible causal variables. So then we could take that and apply it to a more complex assessment of these geopolitical developments. So when we look at the developments that we've seen since 1994, there's a term that I use, which I call the incentive structure of compromise. And what we've seen is that there's a serious limitation in the incentive structure of compromising, of negotiations. And through time, what we have seen is that both parties, Armenia and Azerbaijan, have taken these maximalist posturing, which has produced a polarization effect. Simply put, there is no incentive structure to compromise. Why is this the case? Armenia, for example, we have presented the logic of the victor. Okay, we have won, thus we're going to attempt to consolidate our gains. We do that by perpetuating the status quo. So status quo preservation has been a very, very important element of Armenia's basically underlying mechanism of negotiating. And when we look at this through the domain of a costing benefit analysis, this is the best option for Armenia. We have ascertained what we want to ascertain, and now we seek to consolidate that by preserving the status quo. So in general terms, this has been our position. Now, through the years, this position has methodically hardened. And so once the status quo becomes, not to be tautological, the status quo, it becomes a way of life. And so this has been Armenia's continuous posture, regardless of administration. Azerbaijan's approach has been diametrically the opposite. Azerbaijan has been attempting to create an incentive structure, but they have attempted to do this through a war of attrition. And so as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, they want to make the status quo too costly for Armenia. And so in the domain of risk loss, when Azerbaijan looks at the negotiating structure, their logic is that we've already lost enough. We have nothing else to lose. Therefore, asking Azerbaijan to give more in the negotiating structure really is self-negating. And so what they have done is they have taken a very maximalistic posture on this and saying, we're never going to recognize Artsak's autonomy. And so we have two opposing sides where Armenia's position is, we're never going to have Artsakh in the administration, in the territorial administration of Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is saying we're never going to recognize the autonomy of Artsakh. So what we have seen is, with neither side having an incentive to compromise, war has become the best option that Baku can think of in their attempt to alter the status quo. This kind of better thing allows us to understand that their approach in attempting to kind of shake the system so that they can force, relatively speaking, more compromises from Armenia. Now, part of these sort of explanatory considerations are also what I believe to be the domestic indicators or the domestic economic indicators that we're seeing in Baku. So, you know, if we basically lag the data by 5 years, we go to 2014 or 2015, some things really, really stand out. For the last 5 years, for example, we've seen Azerbaijan's GDP just consistently decline. When we look at things like foreign direct investment, for example, this has also exponentially decreased. Their foreign exchange reserves have massively declined. And if we look at their budget deficit, every year in the last 5 to 6 years, they've had consistent budget deficits. So Azerbaijan, macroeconomically speaking, is seeing serious problems develop economically. And this has been a concern for some time. And now with the drop in the oil prices, there's some perspectives that are being born that suggest that aside from the status quo problems, aside from the Aliyev regime domestic problems, as Anna also referred to, sort of this authoritarian consolidation, on top of all that, we also have to pay attention to the economic indicators that are kind of signaling the problems that Azerbaijan might be having. But and in that context, I also do want to tie in the Velvet Revolution. I come from the sort of the old realist school of thought that, that basically in a very simple way contends that if two parties are of equal power, there's deterrence. But if one party sees the opposing party getting stronger, they're going to attack before they allow that party to get stronger. And what the revolution signaled is that Armenia's continued progress. So Armenia started progressing economically, diplomatically. It developed a lot of international prestige. It basically alleviated corruption in the armed forces, in the institutions, and all this was signaling a growing and more powerful and professional country, which is very different than two autocracies or two non-democratic regimes kind of dealing with one another. And this became very obvious if we see that the speech that Ilham Aliyev gave, he specifically noted that after the Tavush clashes, Azerbaijan made the decision that they're going to act. What the Tavush clashes showed is that Armenia's army was much more efficient, much stronger than Azerbaijan had anticipated. They were fundamentally cut off guard. And so with these developments, we've kind of seen the domestic dynamics as well, the sort of the historically developing variables creating sort of the cocktail, if you will, that exploded into this war. Within this context, we also want to bring everybody's attention to the political objectives of Azerbaijan's military strategy. If any of us have been sort of, looking at the military developments, Azerbaijan has orchestrated a very different military strategy during this invasion than they did in 2016. We are fundamentally seeing a two-pronged assault by Azerbaijan, primarily to the north and to the south. They have primarily refrained from having any head-on assaults within the middle of the of Artsakh, which is the Martuni region. They have basically refrained from that. So their objective has been to utilize terrain that is much easier to conquer, so they can utilize that potentially as a negotiating leverage against the Armenians. And so when we initially saw their assaults, for example, from the north in the Murav Mountains in the Kelbajar region, that proved to be very, very unsuccessful. And then the next day, we saw their chief of staff basically fired and replaced by Turkish advisors and so on and so forth. So we're seeing an important political element in their military strategy. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is if this military strategy is not working for Azerbaijan, is this going to lead to a continuous and perpetuation of the conflict that we're seeing? After basically 15 days of fighting, I did some simple analytics. Azeris have only managed to take approximately 3% of Artsakh after 15 days of fighting. So this whole total conquest, a narrative that Aliyev was trying to project, really hasn't sustained itself. Azerbaijan has been able to take only parts of Tauris, which a few hours ago was reported by Armenia that Armenia has taken back. And Azerbaijan has been able to secure a foothold in Jabrayil down south, and as they attempted to get into Hadrut, they were repulsed. And so after 2 weeks of fighting, we're talking about basically small slivers of land that they've been able to take or that Armenians have strategically retreated from. This is suggesting a continuous and protracted conflict if the political dimensions are not met. So I kind of want to look at these sort of intertwining variables to see where we are, how we are, and why we're here. Armenia's response politically, and the ambassador kind of touched up on this, has been twofold. Armenia has developed two narratives. And I want to kind of touch up on, I think Anna brought this up. I think Armenia is purposefully internationalizing the conflict. Armenia does not want this to remain a sort of a narrow, specific regional variable. We initially began by basically emphasizing Turkey's involvement and then addressing this problem of terrorism. And so we're saying this is an international problem and not a narrow regional problem. What that does, obviously, once you internationalize the conflict, then the international community has to pay a lot more attention to this. So the diplomatic front in Armenia has been very, very sort of intense on these 2 points. We've seen very limited discourse on Azerbaijani objectives, with the exception of them violating human rights or attempting to do ethnic cleansing. The international narrative that Armenia presents is one of Turkish involvement and terrorism. So this suggests a very important attempt to internationalize at least, I think, the narrative, the conflict. And and then this also brings us to think to the geopolitical dynamics that were addressed by both Anna and the ambassador. I believe that Turkey is attempting to alter the power configurations of the region. Is this transactional, or do they have long-term objectives? I think it's really, really early to say that. And I think that is administration specific. If Erdogan sticks around, I think he has skin in the game. He might basically protract this. He's just enjoys doing this with Russia. We've seen this happen in Syria. We've seen this happen in Iraq, and we've seen this happen in Libya. So Erdogan basically has a policy of leveraging local developments to balance out Russian interests in those given conflicts. But fundamentally, the angle that I want to come at has been the Russian response. Okay, so Anna mentioned the Turkish dynamic. I want to address the Russian response. Based on the literature that I've reviewed and sort of a lot of the comments and official statements that we're seeing, some of the analytics are very nascent that we're seeing is three sort of schools of thought have presented themselves with respect to the Russian response. One school of thought has argued that Russia has sort of this grand strategy for the region, especially if conflict breaks out. And some of these proponents have argued that Russia's intent at this point is to basically allow Armenia to struggle, to have difficulties, maybe to punish the Pashinyan administration, but then eventually to kind of swoop in and save the Armenians, come in as the savers. And with the sort of the eventual objective of having some kind of Russian troops or Russian presence in the Artsakh border. So this school of thought basically suggests a long-term Russian presence is the end goal of the current posture that Russia has. I'm not entirely a proponent of this school of thought, and I'll explain in a second. But my underlying premise is that if Russia has to do a trade-off of punishing Armenia and become the savior, that the trade-off would be allowing Turkey to have a presence in the region. I don't think that's tenable or acceptable to Russia. So this is one school of thought that's out there, but I don't really subscribe to this. The second school of thought, this kind of borders of the conspiratorial, is a suggestion that there's some tacit agreement between Russia and Turkey, that Russia had some knowledge Turkey would intervene on behalf of Azerbaijan, but not to the extent to which Turkey is doing. Again, my concern with these two schools of thought is the following. The Southern Caucasus remain an important part of Russia's security architecture, Russia's so-called southern flank. And because Russia considered this its so-called a privileged zone of influence, I find it very difficult to believe that Russia would knowingly permit Turkey to have any kind of a foothold in a region that is extremely important to its security architecture. We note that, for example, Russia has already lost Georgia in the south. Apparently, if Turkey keeps stepping in and absorbs politically and potentially militarily Azerbaijan, then Russia now loses Azerbaijan in the sphere of influence. And so it only remains with Armenia. And so much of its southern flank is potentially exposed. And let's not forget that the biggest red line for Russia is NATO presence or a NATO member being present in its backyard. And so the big part of the Georgia-Russia war because of that. And so now Turkey being a NATO member and having a foothold in Azerbaijan is a serious concern from the Russian perspective. And so very early today, Lavrov basically came out and said, Turkey is not going to have a role in these negotiations in the OSCE Minsk group. This is not how it works. Turkey cannot have a presence, a diplomatic presence and potentially military presence going forward because Russia views this and jealously guards this as its own capacity for implementing its influence in the region. And so what I subscribe to is the third school of thought, which is that Russia was basically taken by surprise. Okay, I think that Russia became complacent, assuming that its reigning traditional policy on the region was sustainable. And Turkey basically took the initiative and caught Russia by surprise as far as this dynamic is concerned. And Russia's basically policy on the region has collapsed. So Russia right now is playing catch up in my perspective. They don't want to marginalize Azerbaijan because they have very important oil and economic relationships with them. But at the same time, they understand that they have very important security guarantees of Armenia. And also, after the Velvet Revolution, they're trying to kind of develop their soft power in Armenia as well. So Russia has to play a balanced game between these two southern neighbors while having to push Turkey back from further influencing Azerbaijan. So this is why I think Russia is attempting to sort of reconstruct a new policy while utilizing the ONC Minsk infrastructure to regain its sort of iron fist over the region. And so what remains to be seen is the extent to which Russia is willing to go to push Turkey back and indirectly also kind of punish Azerbaijan for bringing Turkey into the ballgame.
May I jump in? So if you could sum up, Dr. Kopalian.
And yes, so that's basically a thing. I was actually concluding the comments. So at this stage, we're waiting to see what Russia's nascent or re-articulated policy is going to be in solving at least the military part of this conflict, and then possibly if we can get into the negotiating process, which is a whole different sphere of complexity that we haven't even touched up upon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kopalian, for a really wonderful presentation. It was very interesting. And I'll just highlight a few of your points. And first of all, the concept of incentive structure of compromise, and your explanation was very interesting regarding the positions of Armenia and Azerbaijan regarding status quo and general incentives. And also in this context, I thought that always the matter of Batna comes best alternative to the negotiated agreement comes to the picture, because when sitting at the negotiating table, the sides also have this Batna calculation for each of them. And Azerbaijan's, your analysis of states of economy was very interesting. And also the Velvet Revolution. And so the positive effect of the Velvet Revolution on Armenia's state of affairs, and also resilience of the strengthening of the resilience, etc., was very, very interesting. And your Russia's role and different debate. The conclusions are very, very interesting. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions in this regard. Thank you once again. And let me move now to our third distinguished speaker, Armenian. And also when Dr. Grigorian will be presenting, it would be interesting also to know his opinion about the regional security architecture and how he assesses its role in this process. Thank you. You have the floor, Dr. Grigorian.
Mr. Grigorian,
Dr.
please.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I just noticed that I was on mute. I'm sorry. So thank you, Ambassador Bayburtian, and I want to thank the ARPA Institute for organizing this very timely and important conversation. Since I'm the third panelist, perhaps things I say will cover some of the same ground, but perhaps on certain issues my emphasis will be somewhat different. So I want to begin by framing the problem as one of deterrence and deterrence failure. And I want to do it in the context of a very specific question, which is, was the status quo established after the 1994 ceasefire sustainable in the long run? I will answer that question immediately, and then I'll explain why I think that. I don't think that status quo was sustainable. I think a war was going to happen sooner or later unless there was a political solution that ended the conflict. The parties came quite close in 1997 to such a solution, but you know the story, you know the history of that crisis in Armenia, which led to the resignation of the first president. And save for such a political solution, I don't think that status quo was sustainable in the long run. And here is why I think that. The Armenian victory was not a total victory. It was not one which forced Azerbaijan into a capitulation. It was a limited victory. So that's the number one point to keep in mind whenever we think about the Armenian victory in 1994. The second point with regard to the status quo being difficult to sustain was that after, at some point in the mid-90s, Armenia entered a period of relative decline vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, which doesn't mean that Armenia was declining in absolute terms. Armenia did experience growth after 1994, but at some point the Azerbaijani growth simply dwarfed that of Armenia, which provided the resources necessary for rebuilding their military and for hoping for a military solution at some point. And the third element of that status quo was deterrence by Russia. I mean, it wasn't just deterrence by Russia, just militarily speaking, it was a combination of fear of Russian intervention in case somebody violated the status quo. Deterrence was strengthened further by the fact that the terrain in Karabakh was very unfriendly for the attackers, so it was perceived to be a very difficult undertaking at the time. And certainly earlier, the Azerbaijani army was not prepared enough for such an undertaking. And finally, Azerbaijan did not have incentives to do it sooner rather than later, as long as it was growing faster than Armenia. And here I find Dr. Kopalian's argument and observation quite interesting, that perhaps it may have played a role that in recent years the Azerbaijani economy was not performing quite as well as earlier, and that may have created and you know parallel with that, the Armenian the state of the Armenian economy and the cohesion of the Armenian state was showing signs of improvement after the Velvet Revolution, which may have generated a sense that there is a window of opportunity that is closing. So that's kind of interesting. But as long as the Azerbaijani economy and the military capabilities were growing faster than that of Armenia, they did not have incentives to do it sooner rather than later. Now, what changed really, you know, why did that status quo, even though I'm arguing that it was not sustainable in the long run, we have to explain why specifically now. What exactly were the changes recently that may have contributed to the re-escalation of the conflict? The Armenian Revolution was certainly one of the reasons. And in addition to what Dr. Kopalian suggested, I have a couple more things to add as to how the Armenian Revolution may have contributed to destabilization of the status quo. Number one, it may have created, and again, this is subject to dispute, and I think Dr. Ohanyan and Dr. Kopalian, you know, have doubts about this argument as to whether the revolution has created some kind of a daylight between Armenia and Russia, whether there is some degree of hostility toward this government in Moscow. I mean, I don't want to make very confident statements about that. There was certainly in the public discourse in Russia and in circles quite closely connected to the Kremlin and quite closely connected to Russian intelligence, there was a lot of hostility toward the Pashinyan government, and there was a lot of conversation about it being kind of a Western project, quite similar to that of Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I don't want to confidently claim that this perception was shared, or this attitude was shared in the Kremlin, but certainly there was that kind of talk and quite a bit of it in Russia. And however real it may have contributed to the Azerbaijani perception that there is such a daylight, and Russians may not be all that unhappy if Azerbaijan tries to make some gains on the battlefield in Karabakh. And the second way in which the revolution in Armenia may have contributed to destabilization of the status quo was that, in effect, Armenia left the negotiating process. Now, there are a couple of ways to think about this. So one way to think about it is that Nikol Pashinyan was in fact more hardline in his attitude than Serge Sarkisyan and Robert Kocharyan, or that Nikol Pashinyan sensed an improvement in Armenia's position, which hardened his attitude and his negotiating stance. There is also the argument that Pashinyan himself made, which was that he was not elected by Karabakh Armenians and he could not negotiate on their behalf. So they have to change the negotiating format. Now, this may as well have been the honest position of Nikol Pashinyan and a political reality that was inescapable somehow. But the effect of it, no matter what the motivation was, what the explanation was for the changed position of Armenian diplomacy, in effect, Armenia withdrew from the negotiations under the Madrid principles and insisted on Karabakh's inclusion in the process, which was going to meet very, very serious Azerbaijani resistance. Not only it was going to meet serious Azerbaijani resistance, in effect, that put Aliyev in a position where he either would have to make concessions to Pashinyan or escalate somehow. And, concessions were going to be politically very, very difficult, especially the concession of re-including Karabakh in the negotiating process. The other factor that has changed and almost certainly has contributed to the re-escalation of the Karabakh conflict is, of course, Turkey's transformation and increased activism of Turkish policy around the periphery and 360 degrees. Turkey has problems with everybody these days. The Caucasus was not going to remain untouched by this transformation. And I want to point out something which is important here. I think a lot of people are trying to explain why Turkey has adopted this new, very aggressive posture, and whether it's a serious departure from its traditional stance. I think it is a serious departure. And I think at some point the Turkish elites have given up on inclusion in the European Union, which has been a policy of Turkish governments and Turkish elites for a very long time. But as you all know, it has not been a successful policy. And at some point, I think Erdogan decided that it's just a fool's errand trying to pursue that policy. And he turned his gaze eastward and toward the Islamic world, and he has somehow decided that he's going to become a caliph. And in that capacity, of course, Azerbaijan was the first candidate to be a junior partner for Turkey and the beneficiary of this Turkish policy. And I think that has played a role in encouraging Azerbaijan's more aggressive stance and calculations that with Turkish support, perhaps it's not too dangerous re-escalate the conflict. One other factor related to this is the Russian-Turkish relationship. Now, a lot was said by previous speakers about Russia's bottom line in the Caucasus and how strategically important the Caucasus is and Armenia is, and I share these points fully. But I have to add one caveat. Over the recent years, despite the many problems and divergent preferences between Russia and Turkey have also experienced a degree of rapprochement. There is a lot of cooperation between these two countries. And I would argue that this is the consequence of the distancing of Turkey from the West, and at the same time, Russia's existing conflicts with the West, and the kind of pressure that the West has put on Russia has resulted in this Russian strategy, which is not manifested only in the case of Turkey, but it has been manifested in this case as well, which is to exploit wedges within the Western allies wherever possible. And the Turkish-Russian cooperation has to be understood in this context, and it has happened, again, despite the many divergent preferences and conflicts the two countries have. Now, this may have contributed to an emboldened Turkish attitude, and this may have also contributed to a degree of erosion of Russian deterrence. Now, clearly, Turkey has not attacked Armenia directly, which would have triggered the alliance between Russia and Armenia, but it has allowed itself to meddle and to do certain things and to play salami tactics that it would not have allowed itself to do before, because again of this rapprochement and because of the certain degree of erosion of Russian deterrence. Now, what is the likely outcome of this war? And I mean politically, the likely outcome as well as militarily. I don't want to speculate on the likely military outcome of the war. I will only point out that this is really an unequal fight, and you all should be aware of it. And I think it is a good idea to be tough and not to panic and not to not to be pessimistic about what's happening on the front, but you have to be aware that this is a fairly unequal fight, and unless there is help and there is some third-party intervention at some point, and I'm talking about Russia, this may continue for a long time, and it is not in Armenia's military and political interest for this to continue, for the simple reason that in terms of resources, we cannot afford an attrition war with Azerbaijan. Now, if that were to happen, if the war was stopped, obviously this is not going to be politically. If it stopped the way that I described, it is not going to be terribly good for Armenia politically, because it is going to only increase Armenia's dependence on Russia. And I don't mean that it's particularly bad because it's dependence on Russia, but no matter who it was, it's going to erode Armenia's maneuver space and real autonomy in international affairs. So in that respect, I'm a little worried. Ultimately, however, I think Yerevan is I don't know if the participants in the seminar know that, but I'm talking from Yerevan, and it's really tragic what's happening with the deaths of these young soldiers. And it's mounting and it's getting worse. And I think this war should stop sooner rather than later, and we should make every effort to help stop this war. I'm going to stop there. I'm sure there will be other questions about the future of the conflict, about the likely the likely format of future negotiations and what consequences this war is going to have on negotiations, etc. But for the sake of saving time and leaving more time for Q&A, I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grigorian, for your absolutely interesting presentation. And so how you structured your presentation was really interesting. Status quo being sustainable or not, and you bring to the attention and analyzed, discussed all the factors that affect the matter of sustainability of the status quo, starting with Armenia's victory of 90s being not complete, Armenia's Velvet Revolution's impact and different perspectives of that. Also, it was interesting to know about Azerbaijani perception of Russia's interest in this and vis-a-vis Armenian authorities. Velvet Revolution is also destabilizing factor on status quo, and including Armenia's withdrawal from negotiations under Madrid principles, and Turkish policy, Erdogan's policy, I would say, and Azerbaijan's role in this as junior partner for Turkey, Russian-Turkish relationship, very interesting perspective you drew for us. And your projection of the outcome of the war and the role of Russia in this process. Thank you very much. And we already have many questions, so let's move to the questions. I will be reading the question, and will be asking you, leaving up to you to choose who wants to answer the question and moving forward to another one, if that's acceptable for everyone. So the first question is regarding the Turkey's role being transactional or long-term objective. How do you explain Turkey moving large number of troops and heavy artillery to Azerbaijan for joint military exercises? Does this give us clue their direction or intention? And there is another question about Turkey. Let me also combine these two questions. Now that we have all the facts that Turkey actively participating indirectly and supporting Azerbaijan and killing civilians in this war, will this give NATO reason to remove Turkey out of NATO? Please, who wants to respond?
Can I jump in very quickly on the first part in particular? That's a very good question. And as Arman mentioned, and I think Nerses also, that this is a moving target. I think we know a lot by now as to how Turkey has been behaving in Libya and in the Mediterranean and then in Syria. I do think my previous book on Russia abroad was very much focused on how Russia is building conflicts in its vicinities in order to project power globally, to localize, as Nerses put it, local cleavages, use them, leverage them globally. This is a short-term gain, but a long-term liability for, it was for Russia, and now it would be for Turkey. I do think that Turkey is building a new conflict, is contributing to regional fracture in South Caucasus, which will allow Turkey to have his hands on various issues, whether negotiating with Europeans. And one more point in regards to the distinction between Turkey and Russia. Turkey, in contrast to Russia, is part of so many Western institutions, international security institutions. And in my view, actually, obviously, Turkey is what I call a subsidized power by the West, courtesy of the Cold War, the need to have an ally in that region, etc. So Turkey is part of some of these institutions, but it's going back to the BATNA, the best alternative negotiated outcomes. It is able to hit at these institutions while it is going rogue on different parts of the world and in this region, right, around Russia's vicinity. So in contrast to Turkey, Russia is an institutional power. It has been challenging American hegemony, Euro-Atlantic hegemony, but it is trying to play, at least formally, by the international rules. Even the Crimea annexation was presented through a referendum. So in parallel, Russia has been building its own institutions, but there's a very big difference between Russia and Turkey in that Russia is an institutional player. It allows Russia to be actually much more actually strategic in playing all sides. And sometimes it will go through these organizations that it created to say, well, I can't come to the help of Armenians because Armenia is CSTO and I have to come to the aid of Armenians, but I can't because I'm part of the Minsk group. So I think that's an important distinction. So perhaps Arman or Nerses can take the second one as to the kicking NATO, Turkey out of the NATO, the likelihood of that.
Sure, I'll touch up on that. As Anna mentioned, Russia, internationally speaking, in hegemonic studies, is a legitimate revisionist state. It tries to revise the international order. Turkey is a pseudo-revisionist state. It basically is attempting to revise whatever it could revise without a grand strategy. Now, the reason I'm bringing it up is because NATO doesn't like revisionist states. So when one of their own is attempting to act revisionist, this creates important problems in NATO's architecture as far as the global security is concerned. But more specifically than that, there is no mechanism in NATO, if I recall correctly, to kick a member out. The institutional structure of the organization does not have a mechanism of removing a member. I think Turkey would need to be basically forced to leave on their own terms. But fundamentally, I'll just bring up two very quick examples that have been developing recently. Turkey, with its whole blue homeland policy, where they're trying to basically expand throughout the Mediterranean, has brought them in conflict with a NATO member, Greece. When at the same time, France, another NATO member, had to come to the aid of Greece in an act of brinksmanship to tell Turkey to back off. So you've seen conflict developing between three NATO states that is really unheard of in the past. So that's one dynamic. The second dynamic has been the United States for some time talking about removing its military base in Incirlik, Turkey, and taking it somewhere else. The discussion in of itself is a very, very big deal. And approximately, I think it was about a month ago, where even though the United States has a basically naval base in Incirlik in Turkey, but this new warship that was basically brought to the Mediterranean, they actually parked it in Cyprus, not in Turkey, which really upset the Turkish elite. So we're getting these sort of signals and symbols from sort of the NATO elite that demonstrates a relative distrust and a great deal of dislike of the way Turkey is behaving in itself. But whether that's going to lead to Turkey's expulsion from NATO, I don't think we know, because there's no precedent for that. And I'll leave it at that.
I'll just add a couple of sentences. I think Turkey's goals are long-term. I think Turkey simply aspires to become a regional hegemon. That's the term that comes to mind when I think about Turkey's policies. And it is not in the interests of NATO. It is not in the interests of the United States for that to happen. But to what extent the United States is willing to prevent that from happening is a question that is very difficult to answer, especially, again, given that the United States and Russia have their own set of disputes and disagreements, and preventing something like Turkish hegemony in the region from happening would require a US-Russian cooperation. And I do agree with the statement that we do not have a precedent of any country being kicked out of NATO. and I don't even know, again, just like Dr. Kopalian, if there is a formal procedure for it. The only thing I would add about that is that with the disappearance of the Soviet threat, this was bound to happen sooner or later. It is not clear why NATO even exists, frankly, and you know, all sorts of problems within NATO are going to gradually manifest themselves. This is just one of them.
Thank you very much. And before proceeding to other questions, so let me say that I have an emergency and I have to leave now because it's very, very important. And so I do apologize for this non-conventional role of the moderator that I am assuming. Sorry, I'm really sorry about this, but I have to leave. And probably Mr. Panosyan can continue as a moderator, but let me read some questions that are asked. And one question relates to the role of Israel siding with the Azeris, role of Iran as a neighbor to Armenia, the role of the US in this presumably regional war, and then speculations or projections on US taking steps, if any, to de-escalate the conflict or to remove Turkey from NATO. And another question is linked to this one. Why is Trump administration completely silent on all of this? Also, the role of Trump's administration playing in regards to Turkey and Azerbaijan aggression. Again, about involvement, the role of Iran and Pakistan involvement in this conflict. How can Armenia capitalize on this war and gain recognition of Artsakh? And a specific question to Professor Ohanyan relating to jihadi groups. I should apologize again and thank you for your wonderful presentations and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I do appreciate.
We appreciate what you
Thanks.
do, and we know you're very busy, and thank you for taking the time and participating.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Okay, I guess whoever wants to take the questions that the ambassador read, especially the ones that he mentioned about the conflict and the participants and the roles. Anna, you want to start?
All right.
Arman, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Arman.
Go ahead, Arman.
All right, I'll take one piece of it. I won't try to answer all the questions, so we can each take one of those questions. I think the Israel question is one that interests a lot of people, and it generates justifiable and understandable passions. It does require some commentary and some explanation as to what's happening there. Now, there is no question that what Israel has been doing, not only selling arms to Azerbaijan, but continuing the sale of arms in the midst of this conflict is something that is absolutely objectionable and intolerable. However, I think there is a tendency to single Israel out in this regard and to make attributions and to make arguments that are probably not warranted. Israel's argument is that it's an open arms market. Everybody's selling weapons to everybody, and they have approached Armenia in the past, and Armenia has declined the purchase of Israeli arms by presenting various arguments. In general, Armenia and Israel have had a very difficult relationship, but that difficulty, the difficulty in the Armenian-Israeli relationship, I think of it more in terms of tragedy, in the sense that, the two countries have quite naturally had very divergent interests. Iran, for example, has been a very, very important partner for Armenia, and Israelis consider Iran an existential threat, right? So they have done business with Azerbaijan because of oil and because of their old strategy of finding Muslim countries or nominally Muslim countries in the periphery of the Arab world, or as a market for their weaponry. And it is not necessarily directed against Armenia, but it has had the consequence of antagonizing Armenia. There have been all sorts of problems with the Armenian communities in the Middle East, and how the conflicts between Israel and the Middle Eastern countries has affected this relationship, etc., etc. So this is quite a tragic and difficult situation. And I do think that Armenia should work toward convincing Israel to change its policies, but I don't find it helpful when the outrage and the anger at those policies morphs into into comments that are going to do more harm than good, that are not designed to remove this problem, to mend the relations, but are essentially going to have the consequence of exacerbating them. And I don't have a problem in principle with exacerbating relations with anybody, including Israel. But Armenia cannot afford too many adversaries. Let me put it that way. And we should be careful in antagonizing Israel as well.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Go ahead, Nurses.
Yeah, I was just quickly going to add that I believe that Israel's relationship with Azerbaijan is heavily transactional. The weapons that they sell, they get paid for by oil because Israel has a great dependency on that. But now there's all this literature out there that with Israel, with the new Abrams Accords that was signed between Israel and various Arab countries, that they'll be able to have access to oil from them, and that could possibly potentially mitigate the nature of this transactional relationship. But fundamentally, I think Israel isn't inherently anti-Armenian. They view rather Azerbaijan as a strategic partner, because if we look at most of the operations that Israel carries out against Iran with respect to its nuclear facilities and things of that sort, they're primarily carried out through the Azerbaijani border. So Azerbaijan has a very strategic and important relevance to Israel as far as Iran is concerned. So the dynamics are much more complex than simply being specific to Armenia. And so I would have to agree that, antagonizing Israel at sort of this ontological level, that they hate us and there's an evil in what they do, simplifies a more complex dynamic, and which is that the relationship is strategic and it is transactional, and it is not necessarily against Armenia, but rather to advance the interests of Tel Aviv.
I'll jump in to kind of move the conversation forward towards the US so that we can make some progress on the questions that I'm looking at Zoom. In the Zoom chat, in the chat room. The United States component is fascinating. I think the obvious one, sort of the more immediate short-term responses are obvious to all. This is an unprecedented presidency. It will not be in the United States. It's not an exaggeration to say, because this particular administration has personalized its power extensively on various occasions. And here, conflict of interest between Trump administration in Turkey, business interest in Turkey and in Azerbaijan. The New Yorker has run a very extensive report several years ago documenting Trump companies, various connections in Baku, which were then linked to Iran, money laundering, etc. So I won't go there. That's pretty obvious. But in the long term, perhaps actually does depend as to short term as to who will come to power after November. But in the long term, I think the West and the United States in particular have been grappling with this question, what to do with this increase of authoritarianism and democratic declines. How far should the United States go in defending it? Color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia have been an example of more assertive support for such internationally supported revolutions. So essentially there's complete pullback by the United States, and I call this the West's Goldilocks problem: too big, too small, just right. The West hasn't figured out how to respond to armed conflicts and wars, such as the one in Artsakh, between full-blown intervention state building versus no response when massive human rights abuses are happening. So that's one problem. But in the long term, and I think this is where the Velvet Revolution is important, the Armenia really needs to make the argument, or actually even within the United States, there are voices which argue for defensive support of democratic governments. Instead of trying to export democracies to new countries, the idea is to defend and consolidate and deepen and support where such democratic breakthroughs exist. In ongoing work that I have, which is not published yet, I have advocated that, argued that the West needs to support democratic clusters when they emerge, and much harder confrontation to authoritarian hegemons, such as the case in Turkey. And this was before actually this started. So I would, in regards to, there's also a question on this, I do think that only the United States can constrain, short-term can constrain Turkey, and Turkey has shown susceptibility to a hard push, as it was the case in the Mediterranean, even though Erdogan's language remained bellicose. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in this particular case in Artsakh, and for the West to push. So I subscribe this to inaction. Pompeo refers to this conflict as over real estate, which demonstrates as to how I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, but how misunderstood the notion of the claim of national self-determination is, and its connection to similar national self-determination and self-governance, which the Velvet Revolution brought to Armenia. So there is a human rights discourse that Armenia can push, which politically is much more easier to connect to American values, at least in the long term.
Thank you, Anna.
That's an excellent analysis, Anna. It was very good, very perceptive. That's precisely how we should operate. But this only can happen.
Kunal, just a minute. There are questions before you, please.
No, I'm just commenting and saying thank you to Anna.
Thank you, Kunal.
Thank you. Now, Harut Brunosian says that the documentation of facts, historical, political, demographic, regarding Artsakh are not being considered. And I guess then, is that an important factor that should be considered as well? Maybe historically or legally? In other words, in the way I understand it is, since Russia decided that this part belongs to Azerbaijan, is that enough to claim that this is now a legal border and therefore it should be kept the way it is?
Can I take it?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that the revolutionary government in Armenia did, and Nikol Pashinyan personally, and there was one episode where the foreign minister, Mr. Mnatsakyanyan, also made that comment. So on a few occasions, they presented the conflict in Karabakh to Western audiences as one about historic justice and historic rights of the Armenian people over Karabakh. Now, to all of us, that seems eminently reasonable and just and obvious. This is not an argument that has any weight whatsoever in international law or in international politics. In fact, there is no easier way to antagonize, especially a Western audience, especially an American audience, than to talk about historical justice and historic rights. I think the question should be framed solely in terms of the human rights of the people of Karabakh, the rights of national self-determination. And now there is an additional argument that Armenians should actually emphasize even more than the national self-determination. And this is also an argument that is gaining more traction in international law. And that argument is remedial secession. In other words, we should insist on the idea, on the obvious idea that given what Azerbaijan has done and threatened recently, the expectation that the Armenian population of Nagorno Karabagh will somehow reintegrate into Azerbaijani society and not fear destruction is absolute absurd, and it cannot be done. And again, this is a concept and doctrine that is becoming more and more important and popular in international law. But we should stay away from the argument that we have lived there for 1,000 years, that it's historically Armenian, that there are churches there, and Azerbaijan is only 100 years old, and Stalin gave it to Azerbaijan. Nobody cares. These are arguments that generate absolutely no sympathy. And again, regardless of what we think about them, the point here, the important point here is how these arguments are going to be received by the targeted audience, and nothing else should count.
Could I jump up? Sorry, go ahead, Narcis.
That's an excellent point. I just want to add something very quick. Armenians utilize this argument to control the narrative, but when it comes to international law, as Arman said, there's absolutely no legal standing for that. Because if we look at after the collapse of the Soviet Union, international legal precept called utai possedatis was utilized, which basically means as it stands. Mm-hmm. So the borders as they stood after the fall of the Soviet Union are the international recognized borders. To present historical basis as reasons to basically detach these borders, the reason why the international community is not acceptive of these kind of arguments, because then we're gonna have to go back to Africa, for example, and redraw all the maps of Africa. Or it goes to the whole argument that some people in Russia make that Ukraine was never really a country, so it shouldn't exist as one, or Belarus, so on and so forth. So the historical discourse has no standing in international law. And if we use that historical discourse, yes, we could basically gain sympathy in some circles by virtue of having claims of historical justice. But as far as international law is concerned, those arguments have no basis. They really don't provide us any leverage whatsoever. Yes, Anna.
Just agreeing to all what you said, completely 100%. And simply to add to that, Artsakh, I used to actually stick to Nagorno Karabagh, by the way, but after the bombardment of Stepanakert, that's it. I think scholarly, and it's unconscionable even to use the Nagorno Karabagh anymore, and precisely because there is an opening for the remedial sovereignty argument. But Artsakh has something very important going for itself, and that is its de facto status, its political status as a de facto state, meaning that it has demonstrated it's built institutions from scratch. It has worked towards self-governance. It has a parliament. It has some civil society. It has a constitution. All of those things indicate that this is this is an opening for so far, this types of de facto self-governance hasn't garnered any sort of political support international for recognition. However, I think things are shifting. As I mentioned already, the increasing instability, growing claims, similar claims for national self-determination will be increasing. So just bombing anyone who is asking for greater rights and national self-determination, that's not a recipe for a stable world order, whatever that means. So supporting the and keep in mind as to how much money United States has spent in building Kosovo, building institutions in Kosovo or Bosnia and Herzegovina or East Timor, you name it. So I think this is also an important argument to make, that Karabakh has already, Artsakh has already done significant state building. It is under threat by the Azerbaijani government, Aliyev regime, and any integration of Artsakh back into its original state, in this case Azerbaijan, would require power sharing. Aliyev government cannot even share power with its own citizens, let alone with its minorities. So I absolutely agree that historical arguments don't have probably much legal, they don't have much legal currency as well as political. They're kind of divisive, but it's the existing institutions of self-governance and democratization that need to be used, because they also bring up the authoritarianism and the coercion inside Azerbaijan and Turkey that is ongoing right now.
Thank you, Anna. The next question is, it says, why is the new government policies against Russia doing so many different activities? And he has given examples to that is essentially anti-Russian. Does that have any effect?
Could I take this super quickly and get quiet? I don't think the governments, the policy of the Pashinyan regime are anti-Russia. From the beginning, Pashinyan has been very savvy in communicating and registering that there will be continuity with relations with Russia. No one can choose geography. Russia is a large market. Any player that comes to govern Armenia, would it be suicidal to be anti-Russian? What Armenian government has been trying to do is to strengthen representative institutions from bottom up. And this is nothing new, by the way. I think we're guilty of this in political science, in kind of talking and discussing about democracy as if it was given, created and invented by European powers. In some way it was, but as minorities in imperial states, I think self-governance has always been the political resource that helped Armenian communities to survive for this long. The Velvet Revolution is nothing other than strengthening Armenia's ability to govern itself, regardless who is at the Kremlin. It will be Putin, Russian people themselves. In some pockets, obviously Putin has very strong control over the Russian society and the federal system that it created, but you see what's happening in eastern provinces. I mean, I don't think they're anti-Pashinyan policies have been anti-Russia. That's very simplistic, I'm afraid. There's a lot more that goes in it. Armenia engaged with Russia-led institutions. Pashinyan congratulated Belarus's Lukashenko after the fraudulent election, which on the one hand drove me up the wall, but at the same time I understood the strategic reasoning behind it. Sorry, I got overheated.
I'll add one or two sentences to it. So I think there is a sort of tendency in Russia based on their recent experience. And again, I'm saying this with some sympathy for the Russian elites and the Russian state, where democratic revolutions, or the word democracy itself, is associated with some kind of a geopolitical competition and a geopolitical consequence. So I have actually recently, I published a paper in International Security dealing with this issue, specifically comparing the West's attitudes toward the revolution in Ukraine and the attempted revolution in Armenia in 2008. And because the Ukrainian revolution had an overt geopolitical content, it was supported by the West. And in 2008, the Armenian revolution was not supported by it. But even then, I mean, there was this perception in Russia that if something is called a democratic revolution, if there is a mass movement then there is a danger of that movement turning against Russia or changing the orientation of this or that post-Soviet country. So part of it is simply a logic based on past experience and caution that Russian elites have about what can happen. But I have to say that there have been some people and some actions in the government that, unfortunately, I don't think it was intentional. And I agree with Anna that actually the Pashinyan government has done many things to signal continuity of Armenia's policy. At the same time, there is a pocket of the Armenian policy space that is vocally anti-Russian, and some elements of it have had a presence in the government. For example, Pashinyan had an advisor in the early phase of his prime ministership who had been very explicitly and vocally critical of Russia, and that could not have, and he wasn't the only one, and these things could not have missed the attention of the Russian state. But overall, I think the value of Armenia and the Armenian-Russian relations, I think there are strong factors pushing for continuity in that relations, and no matter what government comes to power in Armenia, Armenia is never going to adopt policies that were adopted by, let's say, Saakashvili or the leaders of the Ukrainian revolution. That is just unthinkable for the Armenian case.
I'll just add a very quick point. I think there's a fundamental misconception when there's a suggestion that the current government's policies have been anti-Russian. There's really no evidence of that. What we have seen is that Armenia's political culture has changed, but Armenia's policies towards Russia have not changed. And so many people view the change in Armenia's political culture or democratizing culture, and they automatically presume that's anti-Russian. And off of that presumption, they think there's been policy shifts. But the policy shifts have been very, very consistent. And as Anna mentioned it, Pashinyan getting ahead of everyone and congratulating Lukashenko and Belarus drove his domestic supporters crazy. Armenian civic society was outraged. But that was a certain homage that had to be paid to Russian geopolitical dominance, because there needs to be a point made by this government that our policies or our interests as far as the region is concerned are aligned with Russia. So our domestic developments are separate from regional developments. And as far as our policies are regionally being developed, they do not contradict Russia. And so I don't think we've had anti-Russian policies. But because our internal political culture has shifted, there's this misconception that we have.
Super quick point on that. There's also a lot of Russian studies, scholars of Russian studies who highlight that Russia is not an ideological player. It's not supporting authoritarian governments and punishing democratic ones. It's way more pragmatic. It has been known to support democratic governments that are pro-Russia and vice versa. That's it for that.
Okay, Henry Theriot has a question. He says, as the US learned in Vietnam, the Soviet Union, Afghanistan, and in fact in Azerbaijan, learned in 1992 to 94, superiority on paper is not the same as military success. A key factor has to do with the motivation of those fighting and who is fighting. It appears that the use of mercenaries, whether jihadists or security contractors, is not effective in truly challenging situations, but only when there is a relative power advantage. The reason seems obvious. Mercenaries are not interested in dying for their cause. Add into this the fact that Azerbaijan is using minority groups to fight, as it did in the 1990s. To what extent does the use of mercenaries, as well as not very willing minority groups, affect the prospect of Armenian success, short-term and long-term, if at all?
May I begin?
Anna, you want to start?
No,
All
Arman.
Arman, okay.
I think it is one of the most dangerous things to do to underestimate an adversary. and to lull ourselves into this kind of comfort that, you know, the Azerbaijanis can't fight, the Azerbaijani army is incompetent, they are relying on mercenaries, and we're fighting for our land and they're fighting for conquest. These sort of cliches, I think, are very harmful. And the current campaign, at least up to this point, has demonstrated that we should probably be very careful when we deploy these cliches. I think the battlefield performance of the Azerbaijani forces has not been as bad as these cliches suggest. Certainly, they have not been able to break through and you know, have the blitzkrieg that they would have liked to have. But even, I mean, the fact that after initial failures, after initial difficulties, they did not collapse and they regrouped and continued the offensive is actually testament that you were dealing with a very serious adversary. Moreover, I think there is a technological component to this war now, which reduces the relevance and importance of the infantry soldier. This has not been the kind of war that was in 1992, 1994, where it was just, you know, basically light armed infantry with some armor. The most important weaponry in this case has been artillery, drones, and tactical air defenses. And when you look at the numbers and when you look at the technological picture, I think we should be cautious in our optimism about how easily and quickly we're going to give it to the Azeris.
If I could just add something real quick. The literature on mercenaries in general suggests that mercenaries could play an important role in changing the tide of battle if we're actually talking about highly professionalized mercenaries. What we're seeing right now isn't the importing of mercenaries as people understand it. Yes, they're paid to come, but most of them are non-professional soldiers or village militiamen that are basically being thrown out there. These aren't the mercenaries of South Africa or Russia's Wagner group, who are profoundly sort of special forces operatives that are going to change the tide of battlefield. So in that context, yes, rhetorically, it's beneficial for Armenia to frame this as Azeris lacking the fighting spirit or bringing external fighters. That narrative works. But when we use the term mercenary, we shouldn't assume that these fighters that are being shipped in by Turkey are high quality operatives that are going to change the dynamics of the battlefield. These are, in essence, very low quality, poor individuals from Syria who are being recruited to come for minimum amounts of money. So there's an important element of lack of military professionalism in the thing, in the jihadis, mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, that are being shipped over to Artsakh battlefront.
Okay, I guess there are quite a few questions. We're not going to have time to take all 12 of them, but I'll sort of try to sort through them and see which ones we haven't addressed at all, and try to see if you can answer that. Again, Henry Thoreau says, related to Professor Grigorian's point, is the international legal principle, the responsibility to protect, relevant at all to this situation?
I don't think the responsibility to protect doctrine has the status of international law yet. And this is a doctrine that was worked out in the early 2000s to circumvent the notion of sovereignty and to make the case that if a population is being subjected to severe persecution and is threatened by genocidal violence, then the international community has a responsibility to protect, and sovereignty cannot be a shield, and sovereignty in general should be reinterpreted as custodianship rather than right to non-intervention. So it's a complex of these doctrines that are being debated at the UN and in the international law community. Now, we should, whether or not this doctrine has come close to being accepted as international law, is actually even less important than the other point which I would like to make, which is we should not place so much confidence on international law. International law already envisions intervention, and Article 7, which goes back to 1948, and the Genocide Convention, which obligates the international community to intervene in cases of genocidal violence. But we saw what happened in Rwanda. We also know how difficult it is to define these things sometimes in real time. And ultimately, whether or not there is intervention is determined not whether international law can be, has given sufficient grounds for intervention, but whether the big players think that an intervention is necessary and is in their interests. And if you look at cases of intervention in Kosovo and compare it to what happened in South Ossetia, for example. In Kosovo, the United States was talking about a genocide that was happening and they had to intervene. Again, it was, rescuing a population that was being subjected to genocide. Russians were arguing that that's a violation of sovereignty, it's against international law, there is no Security Council resolution for it, etc., etc. The situation was reversed in South Ossetia. Russia's intervened with the argument that the Americans intervened in Kosovo, and the United States took the opposite position. And in both cases, there was an intervention because one of the great powers was interested in doing so and could deter the other great powers from preventing it. Whether or not we can hope for such an intervention in the Caucasus, I mean, I think, as I said in my presentation, I think if there is such a danger, if indeed there is a danger to the population of Karabakh, I do believe that Russians will step in. And it is not going to be because the international law allows it or doesn't allow it. It's because I cannot imagine Russia tolerating a situation where Karabakh Armenians are wiped out or pushed out of Karabakh. That would not be in the strategic interests of Russia.
Thank you. Then Armen Dergirelian has a question. He says, there are quite important parallels between 1915 and now. It says, then and now an attempt was made to kill or push out people who were or are living on their ancestral lands. In fact, Aliyev has said several times that Armenians should leave Artsakh. We should ask all those countries that have recognized the genocide to recognize Artsakh to prevent repeated 1915. It would be good to hear your panel ideas.
If I could chime in there, that analogy has been utilized several times, but two important points to make. One, as far as the people of Artsakh are concerned, they are now being defended by a professional standing army, whereas in a genocide, there was no army to protect the Armenians. So you don't have a unprotected population that is being subjected to ethnic cleansing in of itself. So our argument is that there's the potential for ethnic cleansing, but as it stands, there has not been ethnic cleansing because our forces have been successful in maintaining our security belt and not allowing the advancement of the Azeris. The second argument that has been presented on this discourse is that, and if we're going to believe the numbers are coming out from Azerbaijan, they've had over 40 civilian casualties. The latest numbers I saw today, we had 31 civilian casualties. So the discourse being brought up is, well, how can you claim you're being ethnically cleansed or whatever the case might be if you're managing to kill more civilians, or you're managing to bomb given cities or villages in basically retaliation to an invasion against you. So capable defense, a competent professional standing army defending an ethnic indigenous population basically creates problems for that parallel. I think in our sort of historical psyche, the way we think is we always view the potential of genocide, which is correct, and the potential of ethnic cleansing if our forces fail. But because we're nowhere close to that, the discussion right now really doesn't hold water if we try to make the argument that, hey, countries that recognize genocide, can you also recognize Artsakh because the people of Artsakh are being massacred or cleansed? They're necessarily not, because they're being defended by a professional army. Should, God forbid, it gets to that level, as Armen brought up, that becomes a different dynamic, but we're nowhere close to that at this point.
Just to add one sentence, even though I agree with Nerses on this point, one thing I would add is that that's precisely what I was referring to actually when I talked about remedial secession. And in fact, I do think, while indeed there is the argument that we have a standing army there and it's not just a defenseless population we're talking about, but it is not irrelevant that there have been statements to the effect of, you know, this is our land and Armenians are guests, or they should leave, or, you know, giving a hero's welcome to an axe murderer in Azerbaijan, and all sorts of things that can be, and in fact, just the fact of a military attack on Artsakh itself is an argument that that population cannot disarm and trust its custodianship and its security to a state that has attacked it, right? Whether we draw the specific analogy with 1915 is a different question. One can agree or disagree, but this argument can be used, and I think should be used in future in future diplomatic discourse by Armenia for as part of this remedial secession doctrine.
Anna, you want to make any comments on that?
It was very exhaustive.
Okay. All right. So I think the last question. So we don't have more time to read all the questions. Thank you very much for the panelists, for your excellent interpretations and analysis and points of view. And thank you all for attending. We will have more of these events in the future, and I will send the emails soon. Thank you all, and we will see you later.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.